Welcome to a recording of the All Ohio 99s as we join them for the February 11th, 2024 meeting, as we have Robert Stroup talk to our group on the Rickenbacker Field history.
Government begins to go full bore into preparing a war effort. And most people, traditionally speaking, have come to the understanding that the United States was sitting on its hands and was not planning to do anything, and then were forced to do something. And that's not actually true. The records bear out that the government was out there in 41 in the summer looking at that land as a possible base. And so several months later, this happens, and they've already done their legwork. And what the federal government wanted to do right off the bat, heading into 1942, was to have a series of lily pad air bases from the East Coast to the West Coast. And their thought was that the war was coming here. And as it turned out, we did have some I guess the Germans had some U-boats off the coast of New York and Boston. But by and large, the mainland of the United States was spared. But they wanted to have this lily pad system of bases so that we could get fighter jets from the East Coast to the West Coast and back as we needed them. And that included refueling them, servicing them, having their pilots get any kind of care they needed, medical, eating, spending a night, all of that. And so in January of 42, that was the plan. And there were a series of 11 or 12 farms out there that occupied that space. And there were a couple that kind of kicked up their heels, but eventually they all capitulated. The government bought that land, and it was a very messy winter. Unlike this winter, it was a very messy winter. And they went full bore into producing that base. And shortly thereafter, maybe February, March of 42, they decided we're going to put glider training here. And so they switched directions. And as the base was being put in, they started to go in the direction of gliders. And what would have been the problem in early 42 with wanting to do glider training?
Getting them up.
There weren't enough gliders to go around. The University of Notre Dame at South Bend had one, and the government confiscated it.
Wow.
And they confiscated another one someplace else in the States. Then they started looking for very small light aircraft that they could remove the engines. And so we had 1,000 men out there when it opened in the summer of 42. 1,000, give or take a few, that had nothing to do. They were just standing around, nothing to do. And but they went ahead with the glider training, and they wanted to have kind of an entry-level training, and then it would move on to the much larger glider, which was designed to carry, maybe 15 troops. They could carry some small armaments, small cannons, and those kinds of things. And that was all a precursor to D-Day, which would come 2 years later in, June of 44? Mm-hmm. June 6th, 44, D-Day. And so that was the plan, and it wasn't working well. They didn't have enough equipment there, but they had some classes that were moving through there. But Central Ohio is not a great place for gliders. All of you that are pilots, you would know that. And so basically, by the time they reached June, or later, I guess it was maybe August, they moved that whole operation west, and I think they moved it to Colorado, if I'm not mistaken. But they had moved a few classes through here. And it was interesting to read the microfilm, which all of the units converted their history logs to microfilm. And those are all consolidated down in Alabama, Maxwell Air Force Base. So when you do research, you're getting government records on this stuff. But it was interesting. Your glider training was pass-fail. Any of you that have done anything pass-fail, you would understand. There is no A, B, C, D, or F. You either pass or you don't. And I guess pilots' licenses are that way. You either pass or you don't.
Right.
And but they would be towed out 30, 35 miles, I think, east of Columbus. And they dropped the cable. And you had to get back to Lockbourne and land safely to pass. And they take you, I mean, just to the edge of what you could make, so that it forced your training to kick in. And so if you were misreading some things, you were not totally prepared, you weren't paying close attention, you would come in short of Lockbourne. And the idea is you need to get every inch of your return, and you had to have been paying attention. And so that was interesting. And some would come in short and land out in Canal Winchester and different places. And they did have a few of the bigger gliders. In fact, I don't know if you saw it, but in the restaurant in here, across from where I was sitting up to the left, they have one of the CG4s. It's an artist rendering of that. It's sort of like a box, and they could get 15 paratroopers in there, or they could get a Jeep, or they either troops or equipment. And the idea was at D-Day that this stuff would come in and it would be so silent that they could land. And they would use gliders at D-Day, but the Germans used telephone pole-like objects that were like toothpicks. And they had those lined up, and there would be gliders that would come in that would just stick on those poles. And so that was not necessarily an easy task to undertake. But by the end of August, they decided, now we're on to mission number 3. We're going to have B-17 4-engine bombing. And the base out there would be among 3 or 4 or 5 locations in the States that were training pilots to be B-17 pilots. And it was a major operation. It brought people from all over the United States in there, and they ended up doing an instructor program. And so many crew members would have passed through Columbus, Ohio, and going off to other parts of the country. And of course, the women's Air Force Service pilots, the WASP, and you're familiar with that iconic photo. If you go over to the Air Force Museum in the World War II wing, they have a big version of that you can see over there. And that's it. Yeah, that's it. That's it. Women were brought in here. I think there were maybe 13 of them. They were federal employees, so they didn't have military rank. They were not in the armed services. And I think they were getting, it's in the book, I don't know, somewhere around $300 a month. And believe it or not, they were only here a short period of time, like less than 2 months or so. And I think 2 of the women got married here in such a short period of time. And the microfilm seems to indicate that they were all outstanding pilots. Even the handful that washed out were very, very good pilots. They just didn't think they were suited to that aircraft. But there were 78 different aircraft that women were trained to fly, from the smallest all the way up to maybe even the B-29. I don't remember. But the B-17, this was primarily the only place they were trained as a group to fly the B-17. And so Columbus, Ohio will forever be linked to that story. It was interesting. Men were being freed to go overseas for combat. And not only did they need women to ferry aircraft from one part of the country to the other, they needed them as test pilots. And so they were serving to do both. And it got so bad out there that even when the base was at its fever pitch, they had all of these departments stick. like shoe repair. They had 2 or 3 guys that were working shoe repair. The war got to the latter part of it, they closed those places. I mean, every available man that could go overseas was going overseas. And so women were brought in here to train on the B-17s. And the reports, which I kind of summarized in the book, the reports from the microfilm was that it was a bang-up success here. There were nothing to point to as any kind of issue or failure. The weather was really bad for that winter, so there was a lot of flying between Columbus and Cleveland, and among other places. And they were always sent with a male officer, and he would put them through a battery of circumstances where they would literally think that whatever he was calling out was, we have an engine out on fire, we have this, we have that. And it turned out that they just responded with enormous professionalism. And then after the program was over, in fact, I have a group picture in here that shows all of the pilots out in front of a B-17. The only thing I wished was at the time they left the nose cone off, and so it's not the best picture because the nose of that aircraft was left off, probably for maintenance at the time. But it's a wonderful picture of all of the gals and training. And again, they were put through a battery of tests and impressed their male counterparts. And so B-17 training was huge here. At the end of World War II, the base started to prepare for a new direction, and a couple of different things. The Tuskegee Airmen were returning. What do we do with the Tuskegee Airmen? They're returning from overseas and have a tremendous record flying, protecting bombers. And what do we do with them? You have all of these service members coming back with all this training and experience and all of these planes and equipment. What do we do with the equipment? What do we do with the people that are trained? The critique of World War I was we just quit. We didn't remain or retain our steadiness of alert. And so it turned out that the National Guard format that you know, Army National Guard, Air National Guard, really takes off following World War II, and particularly the Air National Guard, and the base plays a part in that you have guys with combat experience in planes, guys as mechanics with experience, crew members of all types, and you have all of these aircraft coming back. Let's let them serve 1 weekend a month, more or less, and 2 weeks a year, and let's retain or remain our readiness of alert. And so that base is forever linked with the National Guard. Of course, today there's Army National Guard out there, and they have their helicopters and their flight center, but the Air National Guard would move on to not only having fighter jets out of there, but having eventually air refueling tankers, which they have today. And I'll share a little bit more about that. But so they came back. Interesting enough, most of you probably are familiar with Area 51 near Las Vegas, and since the latter 1960s, that's been where the United States has done its secretive testing. All of our stealth technology, more or less, was developed out there. In fact, if you work there, you have to pretty much live in the Las Vegas area because they put you on a plane and they fly you to work, and the windows are blacked out. And so it's very, very tight security. Been that way for over 50 years. But the precursor to Area 51, most people don't know this today. Precursor was a triangle from Lockbourne Air Force Base down I-71 to Wilmington. You're familiar? Anybody fly in there, Wilmington?
No, we've been over it many times.
Wilmington, and then Wright and Patterson Fields, which consolidated and became Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And so you had a triangle for experimental flying and development of technology, probably from late 45 until the late 48, 49 period. And what happened was Lockbourne and Wilmington consolidated over at Wright Pat. And then for 20 years, all of that stuff was probably late 40s to the late 60s. It was all at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But Lockbourne had its hand in some of that. There's a picture in the book about that. The problem with doing secretive development and test flying at Wright-Patterson Field was that there was residential, and there still is, residential development and housing all around it. There's nothing secret if you're going to put it up. And so that's why everything by the latter 60s went out to what they call Area 51 today. And so that's sort of a highlight that I love to bring up, is that the precursor to Area 51 was in part Lockbourne, Wilmington, and Wright-Pat. And so it's always an interesting, you bring that up with people that know military history, they don't know that. And so I always love to trumpet that. The Tuskegee Airmen did a fantastic job, but there was still racial prejudices. And they were brought back and kept together as a unit. And they were put in places that were very small facilities. And on top of that, they were close to white communities. And I think they were up in Michigan. I know they were in Indiana, and they were in Kentucky, I think. And inside of, I don't know, a short period of time, 12 months, 18 months, I forget the dates anymore, they were moving them. They were having problems. And so they decided, I think they were going to either move them to New England or they were going to move them to Lockbourne. And they moved them to Lockbourne. And it was a blessing on that front, because this was a World War II base, which was like wearing a pair of shoes 3 sizes too large for you. They went from being cramped and not having facilities to being on a large facility and having more room and more buildings, movie theaters, chapels, you name it, they had it, hospital. It was far larger than what they needed. And then residential development was, of course, they've developed to this day all the way out there. But that was a long way from Columbus in the latter 40s. So they didn't quite have some of the racial difficulties that they would have had other places. And so the Tuskegee Experiment Part 2 was not only could they fly and fight, but could they manage administratively a base. And certainly they proved that. In fact, so much so that the orders from Harry Truman to desegregate in the late 1940s, it was because the Air Force was out front of all the other branches of service. And they had a plan in place. And he became a general, but Colonel Benjamin Davis Jr. was a marvelous leader. And he would address his men from the control tower on Saturday mornings, looking down there, and they'd all be lined up in formation. And he would preach that the world was watching, and everything we do counts, and good enough is not good enough. You got to do better. And it turned out that all of their ratings, whether they were flying ratings, they were base administrative ratings, were up. And so the Air Force, particularly because of what took place out here, they were the front runners to that, and it really led President Truman to go ahead and sign that order. And then what they did was they developed panels to review the black service members, officers and enlisted, and decide, what's your skill set, and where do you want to go, what do you want to do, and then they were all dispersed, different parts of the country. And so many of the officers that were there, that had flown as young men in World War II, went on to fabulous careers. And some went on to become Vietnam War pilots, flying aircraft that was so much further ahead than what they had flown, the F-4 Phantoms and, the avionics and all of that stuff. And I think they had 3 or 4 guys that went on to be Vietnam War vets, Korean War vets, World War II war vets. And one of the members became the first service member in uniform to win a gold medal competing at the Olympics, Mal Whitfield. I don't know if you watch CNN News on the weekends. His daughter, for the last 15 years, anchors CNN Saturday, Sunday afternoons. Her last name's Whitfield, and you'll see her. And her dad, Mal Whitfield, won gold medals, I think, in 48 and 52 as a track star, and he would practice and train out there. First black air traffic controller in the United States was Alex Boudreau from out there. And they developed their clubs, and their services were precursors for other Air Force bases. There had not been child care on an Air Force base before life, and the Tuskegee Airmen set a plan in place for child care. And of course, other Air Force bases would follow. Their clubs, which were big on jazz music and dancing and all these things, set the tone for where a lot of base clubs in Air Force bases would go. In fact, that base out there would be known through the years for its base clubs. You know, you had an NCO club, you had an officers club, and some places you had enlisted clubs, and all the way up through the late 1970s, they were known for having out there some of the best base clubs anywhere in the Air Force, and so it just adds to that picture. You come into the 1950s, and the Cold War is on the radar screen, and the Soviet Union is posing a threat, and the United States begins to counter that by spending lots of money. And the Strategic Air Command came in there in 1951 and took that place over, and really expanded. It's the deepest concrete runway east of the Mississippi to this day, 36 inches of concrete out there. If you are able to go in and out of there, that base is still under there. And it's the deepest, I've been told by multiple sources, the deepest runway east of the Mississippi. Was
there a reason they gave it that deep?
Well, good question. It was designed to be heavy bombers, and where SAC salt was going. The B-36, which was a massive bomber, never really got there, but they were thinking that they might even be there, and that they needed that kind of a base. But it's interesting. The Strategic Air Command came in there, and they had two missions that were unusual missions for SAC, and one was reconnaissance, and the other was electronic warfare. And the reconnaissance missions were designed that the jet bombers would be equipped with special cameras in the belly of the aircraft, and then they would fly over to either England, Greenland, or Morocco in North Africa, and from there they'd fly missions over Soviet-controlled airspace. And they try to get 100 miles or so inland, take all the pictures they can, and then get out. And it would scramble Soviet fighters. And long story short, the Soviets were making more inroads with their fighters than we were with our bombers. So they were flying faster aircraft. And another interesting thing people don't know, it's always been said that the United States won the Cold War without a shot ever being fired. That's not true. The jet bombers that were being used for reconnaissance had a tail gun, and it would be cat and mouse. The Soviet fighters would be chasing us till we got out to international airspace, and we would be firing at them, they'd be firing at us. And so if you ever hear that, well, the Cold War was won without a shot, not so. President Eisenhower got really, really antsy when we almost had an international incident from one of the planes out here. It was a very dangerous mission trying to get out, and they thought that World War III could erupt at any moment. So he says, put an end to this. We're not doing this anymore. Let's commission a new plan. Let's go for the U-2 spy plan. And so you remember Gary Francis Powers was shot down and was an international incident of its own. So we went to the U-2 because President Eisenhower said no. And it just happened that a couple of the notorious incidents were from crew and aircraft out here that had been relocated overseas. And so at the same time, Korea, the Korean War is underway, and the very first air refueling mission in a combat zone was aircraft from out here at Lockbourne, and it was over in the Korean War. And just to let you know, there's been uninterrupted, nonstop air refueling from out there since '51. And I've told the commanders out there, I said, as a historian, it is the air refueling capital of the world. All the way up till today, Sunday, what is it, the 11th? Air refueling has been a constant mission out there since 1951. And it's, you know, what is that base ultimately known for? Well, after, what is it, almost 80 years, it's air refueling, among other things, but air refueling is at the top of that list. So you had the Korean War, you had the reconnaissance activities, which were, you know, kind of spy, very interesting spy activity. But you also had electronic warfare. And the whole idea was that radar would pick up United States American bombers. So there would be a plan to divert. And it was a very crude way of dealing with it, but they took B-47 bombers and they took aluminum and shredded it like you would shred paper in a paper shredder in your house. They shredded aluminum by the ton and stuffed it up in the belly of that aircraft. And then they'd fly, if it came to that, they'd fly dozens of those planes. They'd go in one direction. The bombers with the nuclear weapons would go in the other. We'd open those bellies up and we'd drop shredded aluminum by the ton into Soviet airspace. And the idea was Soviet radar would lock onto it and say, here they are. And they'd send all of their fighters in one direction and we'd be going in the other direction. Now, very crude. In a matter of 2 years, by the mid-50s, they had sophisticated it to the point where they went from shredded aluminum to making a compartment for 2 officers to sit in there with a computer system and jam signals. I mean, you talk about night and day in 2 years. So they went to a system where they had 2 officers. They call them ravens. They sit in there and jam signals. And so
They called them what?
ravens, like a bird, a dirty bird. And so that was pretty much, of course, the Air National Guard was playing a big role out there. Their fighter pilots were quite skilled and accomplished and were able to serve into the 1960s, 50s and 60s. They would serve as backups in certain places of the country. It gave the United States great depth with skilled pilots and aircraft and maintenance technicians. And we got to the 1960s. That would be the top decade for that installation out there. By 1967, you had 3 commands operating: Air Defense, Strategic Air Command, and Tactical Air Command. And it was a major center for training for Vietnam. And by the time you get to the 1960s, there's an Air Defense Command unit there. The idea was that we would defend against the threat from Soviets coming over Canada with bombs. They'd come down over the top of Alaska, down over Canada, and they would ideally take out our manufacturing from Chicago to Pittsburgh, Detroit, Cleveland, Indianapolis, St. Louis, Minneapolis, all of those industrial places. So we had to defend them. And the unit that was out here, when they were on duty, they'd be in orange jumpsuits with their boots on, their helmets by their side. When the klaxons went off, they had 2 minutes to get out, get in their aircraft, get it fired up, and be up. And it was the fastest aircraft. They're called the F-101 Voodoo. It's in the book. Faster than the speed of sound. 10,000 foot runway out there, they'd take off, and by the time they got halfway down the runway, they're at 18,000 feet.
10,000 feet.
Wow.
Because they take off and do this.
Wow.
And one of their pilots said, yeah, he says 10,000 foot runway. By the time we got to the middle of the runway, we had reached 18,000 feet. And they had nuclear tipped missiles on the wings. And the idea was they were to meet the bombers over Canada before they got here. And it'd be just like a bowling ball with 10 pins. They'd fire those nuclear tipped Sidewinder missiles, and the idea would be to take out a large swath of Soviet bombers and then have it drop into Canada.
That was
We don't want it here.
Yeah, there you go.
We don't want it here.
No, did Canada know that?
Fortunately, it didn't happen. But that was a mission, and by 1968, they decided, you know, wouldn't it be better if we put this in Minnesota? It's closer to the border. I mean, but it was interesting, one of the lead officers out here who I was able to locate, he was a squadron commander. He said that unit was in such demand in Ohio through the late 1960s for going to 4th of July parades and Memorial Day parades and doing finals. And he said they would have us down to Nelsonville. You know where Nelsonville is?
Oh, yeah.
He said they'd have us down to Nelsonville. He says one year I went by myself for a 4th of July parade and flew over. And they said, next year, could you bring back a couple more planes? He said, yeah. So I think it was 66 or 67. They went back with 3. And one of the wing guys, because it's hilly down there, one of the wing guys got up over a hilly area, and there was a farmhouse, and sheared the bricks off the chimney of the
Whoa. Oh, my. Oh, my.
But not only that, but you know what their training was for the F-101s? They'd have a chase plane, and then they'd have 5 or 6 squadron planes. Of course, they're able to fly at the speed of sound. They'd go down to West Virginia and then chase that plane, either come up 33 or 23. And they would break glass in people's houses all along the way. Curio cabinets, all that stuff. They had an office out there. You could file a claim against the federal government. Your curio cabinet was shattered. your anything glass, you know, you could get the government to pay for it. So that was sort of an interesting thing. Tactical Air Command was located there in 64. They'd be there to 71. They were the C-123, or 130s, excuse me, the C-130s. That pilots were being trained, crews were being trained, loadmasters for Vietnam. And the Tactical Air Command is personnel heavy, just a lot of bodies. So there were, between the 3 commands by 1967, there were about 18 to 20,000 people assigned there, including family. So it was like a city unto itself. And crew members were being trained for Vietnam. And then the gunship training for Vietnam took place there. You're familiar with the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Vietnam, where they got all these supplies, morning, noon, and night and day, weekends. The idea was we had to attack the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they did it at night. And the whole idea was you attack the front of the line and the back of the line, and then they're stuck. And so they took old C-119s, which looked like flying caskets, that were on the way to the boneyard, and they refurbished them. And they got these old guys, old for then, in their mid to late 40s. They weren't flying fighter jets then. These were guys that had flown these as young men. And they set Gatling guns up in the side of the plane. And they painted the underbellies black. It's in the book. And then they banked that plane like this, and it barely almost stalled the thing out. And at night, they just unload. And they call them big spookies because so many bullets were that it made a... And guys could hear it 15, 20 miles away. Could hear that. And they brought the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, back here to Lockbourne to train them to do it.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine that? That's the government saving money. Yeah, they took South Vietnamese crews and brought them back to Lockbourne for their training here. And so that was going on, and then you had the tankers that were flying missions for Vietnam, and so you just had a lot of interesting things taking place there. You get into the early 1970s, and things are transitioning. Keeping all this stuff going is expensive at that point. And so by the end of the decade, they decided to not close it all together because they fought it. They made it a reserve installation. The Air Force Reserve were there, and then it became a facility that was used with civilians, the city of Columbus, and then reserve elements of the Guard, and of course the Marines and the Navy, and all of the branches of service, which of course are there today. But it was interesting that in the 1970s, as the Vietnam War is winding down, the Air National Guard continues to ramp up, and some of what they called U.S. CENTCOM missions were being flown out of there and trained out of there that would eventually be the backbone of the U.S.'s defense in the 1980s. And so it transitioned. And by the way, 1972 brought an end to the Vietnam War, and the Christmas Day bombings of Hanoi, which brought the North Vietnamese back to the bargaining table. Our tankers from out there were flying many of the missions in Southeast Asia, fueling these B-52s, some of which never came home. And so that was an interesting contribution to history. But the facility transitioned into what it is today. It is a reserve. The United States is its backbone is a reserve element. I mean, when you realize what we depend upon with weekenders, not just in the Guards, Army and Air National Guard, but people that are in the Army Reserve, the Naval Reserve, the Marine Corps Reserve. And you saw that in the Gulf Wars. That we don't have a draft, we don't have conscription, and we have a lot of people joining for technology purposes. We don't have a lot of people joining for fighting purposes. And so we are dependent upon a reserve component. And the picture of that in the dictionary would be this place out here. I mean, it's played a major role. They love it for a few reasons, because it's got big runways. If we're ever at it again in a major war, we can get a lot of people out of there and quick. We can get equipment. We've got a 10,000 foot to 12,000 foot runway. Still, by and large, it's very secure because they've got, it's not in the middle of a city per se, and it's got some nice facilities which are still being ramped up and beefed up, and we have all of the branches represented except the Coast Guard. And in some of the conflicts and wars we've had, they've taken their share of casualties. The Marines during the Second Gulf War were hit hard there, didn't come home, and of course the 121st Air Refueling Wing is Air Guard, but it functions as active duty. The Air Force uses them really as an act. Remember 9/11? After 9/11, we had fighter jets for months flying New York City to DC patrolling. It was this unit that was over there morning, noon, and night refueling them. And so they have major equipment there for training boom operators and pilots and the like. And so it's really what I believe to be the air refueling capital of the world. But an interesting story, you remember the pistol packing mamas photo? My advisor reproduced that photo with women Air National Guard pilots right before we did the book.
Yeah, we saw, yeah.
And the only mistake he made was they weren't wearing gloves.
Oh.
They forgot to have them put gloves on, or it would have been a total reproduction. The gal at the end is an interesting story, and I think you might appreciate that. Her name's Heather, The air refueling pilots out there and crew, when they come back from missions, a lot of times they come back late morning or mid-morning and they're done for the day. So they like to go out wearing their flight suits and go out for breakfast. And they can hit some of these small places out and around Rickenbacker that are greasy spoon places. Yeah, well, I don't know about that, but they're in there because of pretty good victuals. And this gal was waitressing tables. And I don't know all of her background, but she had started to take some classes at a community college, and she got to know some of the crew members. They were coming in often, and short story. She said, "What? Could I be a pilot?" They said, "Yes, you can be a pilot. You need to continue with your education, get your degree, come out and see one of our recruiters, and go ahead, and we'll get you in, and then finish your degree, and we'll teach you how to fly." And so she became a pilot, and she's in that picture.
That's amazing.
From what I understand, she learned to fly on a tanker, not a Cessna,
Oh my God.
Wow.
as many do.
Yes.
So her name is Heather. I don't know. She may be retired at this point, and that's like 17 years ago. But it's an interesting story how the National Guard provides opportunities to people from all walks of life to do almost anything you want to do,
Yeah.
and developed a marvelous history and opportunity there.
Do you know anything about the original picture and how that came to be?
Well, I don't, although when I was writing the book, we had somebody somewhere that tried to throw a monkey wrench in it, and tried to tell us it was taken down at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. It wasn't, but they tried to throw a wrench into that. They wanted to claim it as being Dover Air Force Base. Even if it was, they were Columbus pilots, but it was taken out there. It was taken out there. And it's carried the name, the name on the plane was Pistol Packing Bombers, so they kind of refer to it as that. But just has a marvelous history, all kinds of stories. Here's one for you, the B-47 during the 50s, 60s, the jet bombers left there in 64 because they were kind of getting obsolete. But a lot of them would be on missions in the States. And this one crew would go up to Michigan, and didn't the captain fly under the Mackinac Bridge?
Oh my, oh my.
And he wasn't fired, but he was the second time he did it.
Oh, yeah.
His crew turned him in when he went through it again. I mean, we're not talking a B-47 jet bomber. Flew it under the Mackinac Bridge twice.
Fired.
And got fired the second time. Another thing that was sort of interesting was, by the time you got to the 70s, the Cold War and how we were fighting it was changing, and things were moving towards missiles and away from bombers as the lead weapon. And so the United States was concerned that a first strike, we wouldn't be able to get anything off the ground, because they figured less than 45 minutes, a lot of our places could be hit and were caught flat-footed. And so what they decided to do was they decided to take 3 to 5 bombers with nuclear weapons and just move them all over the place. And Grissom Air Force Base out of Indiana would send 3 to 5 jet bombers with nuclear weapons over here. And they just sit idling with the weapons on the runway, waiting for the word. And so these guys would spend boring days. I don't know how many hours at a time. They'd just be sitting on the tarmac, ready to go if they had gotten word from the government to go. And we had an incident out there in 73, March of 73. I guess it's going to be 51 years. The tankers were doing an alert early in the morning. It was foggy, very foggy. And they all had to run out to their planes. And the guy up here at the front right turned a little hard, and his wing went into the cockpit of
Oh,
the next plane, and they both exploded into flames.
oh, my.
And one or two of the crew members were burned very badly. They flew them to Texas. They have a burn unit down there, San Antonio, I think. And but the other plane kept going, and it was headed towards these planes from Grissom. And it was March, and there was a grassy area. I don't know how deep it would have been, but in March, that's soft ground. And that tanker went right into that soft ground and just went down in about 3 inches, 4 inches of mud. Had it been concrete, they were unmanned because the crew was unconscious from the flames. That was headed, I think they were saying it was within several hundred yards of those nuclear weapons.
Oh my gosh.
And what could have come from that? And so, but the most gut-wrenching story I ever heard, I found a pilot living out in Utah, and he's probably since died because this was a long time ago. He said, he told me a story. He said, I've been a lifelong Utah resident except for my 3 years at Lockwood in Ohio.
Wow.
He said, I was low level, and he said, I had wanted to get a flight on a jump seat on a B-47 jet bomber, and he said, after 3 years, I had a contact, and he says, I was within a week or two of being discharged to go home. And the guy says, be out at the hangar at this certain time. He says, okay. And he gets out there, and that hangar is still there to this day. I was in it not long ago. And he's walking through it, ready to make plans to ride jump seat. And this master sergeant comes up running behind him and says, I'm pulling rank, I'm getting on that flight. And so he was just sort of like devastated. He said, I've waited 3 years and I'm gonna be discharged in a week or two. And he says, I guess this is over. He says, can I at least sit outside on a metal chair and watch? And he said, yes, you can. Well, so he sits out there, puts it up against the back of the terminal, or the back of the hangar. And that B-47 goes down to the end of the runway, takes off, nose dives, and explodes into flames
Oh,
at the end of the runway. Everybody on is killed.
Oh my gosh.
And he said, here it is, this was,
wow.
when was this? This was 2007, I talked to him. He says, I'm living to this day because this guy pulled rank.
Wow.
He says,
Oh, my, yes.
he says, bite your lip when somebody pulls rank. You never know what it might mean.
That's amazing.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, wow, that's a good story.
Any questions?
Yes, it's not a question this time. I was 7 years old when this war started, and I live north of Grove City, and I remember those B-17s flying over
Yeah.
in there, so.
Called them a gaggle,
Yeah,
a gaggle B-17.
yes. Many times they flew over the house
Yeah,
on approach, you know.
Yeah.
Rickenbacker. And also my husband, he lived in Harrisburg, Ohio, and on a Sunday, when the war ended, they were in church, and the, son of one of the members flew way low over that church
Oh, my.
on the approach into Rickenbacker, and he says, I'll never forget that as long as I live.
Yeah.
His name was, the pilot was Bob Redmond.
oh my.
So anyway, those are just
Yeah.
little
Yeah.
facts about it.
Yeah.
Really.
I missed what Lockbourne was. Was that another name for Rickenbacker? It was a whole nother field that closed down? What
No, I'm
happened
sorry,
to that?
let me backtrack on that. The base was named for the village, you know, there's a village there of Lockbourne. Of course, the village is really cut off from any economic development because the best of their land was taken by the government. And so I know the mayor out there, they don't have anything but the village. I mean, they can't grow their revenue really. But when Eddie Rickenbacker died in 1973, there had already been plans to rename the base for him. And he probably, to that time, was the biggest name in Air Force history. And so, interesting as it was, when he died in 1973, they made plans to rename it in 1974. I think it was May 18th, and it was named Rickenbacker Air Force Base, and then it became Rickenbacker Air National Guard Base, and then Rickenbacker International Airport.
My wedding anniversary,
instead.
And one of the irony is that
1974, May 18th.
actually, it would have been better if Port Columbus was out there, because they had larger runways and all the, you know,
More room to expand.
yes,
Certainly
they
more
could
room.
expand, but it was a political decision not to do that.
Really?
Right.
Yes,
And why?
politics got into,
For the
well,
revenue they get out in Columbus?
I don't know what the reason is, but,
Somebody's uncle probably owned the
there were a
land.
lot of contractors and everything that, wanted to stay in Columbus. But it would have been a perfect place for Port Columbus to have been.
Yeah, because there was room to grow.
There were, yes,
Yeah,
and they had a category 3 runway out there, which Columbus didn't have for a long time. Category 2, I guess it's called. So, but anyway, just one of those things.
Okay, to follow up, you've brought your book. Would you hold it up and show us your book? All right, where is it available? Do you have,
I
do
have
they
it- I
sell
have it-
through you?
well, it's out of print. I have a case in my, case of 10 in my trunk that's available if you, and I could get you others on another date, I suppose, I could get you some. Yes,
I had another question before, I was afraid we were gonna wrap it up too quick. So it's on military, but did you expand your history into past the 70s? Because I didn't really hear you talk anything beyond 78 or 9 or
well,
80. Do you know anything from 80 on, what was going on there? Didn't they have recently airlines out there?
well, yes,
I mean, I don't know if it's still military and.
it is
airlines, or-
a city of Columbus,
Okay.
it is a state in that the National Guard units,
Oh, they're still there.
yeah,
Yeah, okay.
states, the state of Ohio with them, the city of Columbus, and then there's a private entity. There are, what is it, Spirit? Spirit Airlines.
Allegiant.
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 All right, so
Allegiant.
there's that commercial.
Yeah, there is, in fact, Ohio State football flies in and out of there.
Okay.
For
We had
their
a meeting
games.
there once
And,
on the guard side.
UPS, they moved the freight out of, what was Port Columbus,
Okay.
out there. So UPS and FedEx and Evergreen and some of those other off-brand names that move freight.
Because my husband worked for,
Yeah, there was a fixed base operator, Rickenbacker Aviation Center, and they, the FBRAC used to do the freight handling and refueling for FedEx, UPS, and Evergreen, all out there from the early
I didn't
'80s.
know all 3 were out there, okay.
But I
Well,
heard
the
that
intermodal, I mean, they have through the years, they've had a plan for rail.
The foreign trade zone, I thought that they'd made that designation sometime in the early 2000s. They were trying to get rail and
Yeah.
a whole bunch of enterprise stuff through there.
There's a lot of warehouses out there. It's sort of a joint.
We were headquartered in the old Colonel's building at Rickenbacker back in the day.
Oh, where are you?
At United States Cargo and Courier Service, which was he was a former Vietnam vet. He started a transportation business, LTL carrier out at Rickenbacker Aviation Center in the old Colonel's building. Round Creek kind of came into the Air Force Base right there in the corner. And then we had that FBO with T hangars and places for a number of years under, I think there was an old 99 person out there, Barb DeLong was.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
She used to work out there at Rickenbacker Aviation Center.
Okay. I remember years ago, I don't know if you guys, probably 15 years ago, I arranged for us to go out to Rickenbacker and we saw those. And we got to lay in the tubes where they did the booms and see how the guys did the booms and
Yeah.
stuff.
And we had an air race
Air
that started out there.
Yeah, that was
started
Barton.
along too.
Was-
That was 92.
Plus Buck Ewing flew out of there, didn't he? As a KC-135
Yeah,
pilot.
I went up with one of my students, he was a captain at that time, and he took me up for a
99.
refueling mission was neat.
Of course, they're known for their air shows.
Oh, yeah.
There will be another one this year.
Yeah.
The ones in the 70s were known for being some of the best anywhere in the United States. Yeah, known for those. Back to Eddie Rickenbacker, very interesting. Couple of interesting things about him. You know, he grew up on the South End, and at one time, the three biggest names in Air Force history all have a connection to that little area. Curtis LeMay is an Ohio State graduate, I think South High School graduate. Of course, Eddie Rickenbacker came off of, I think, South High Street. And then Chuck Yeager remarried a gal from Canal Winchester. And for a time there, they were living in Canal Winchester. Chuck Yeager, Eddie Rickenbacker, and Curtis LeMay, probably the three biggest names in Air Force history. All not just a little connection, but probably between High Street and Canal Winchester, all three of them. But back to Rickenbacker, it's interesting. His dad dies when he's about 12. And he's like the second oldest of 8 or 9 kids. And so he had to be the breadwinner at age 12. And he worked in a warehouse, pushing broom, doing whatever he could do at 12 years old to be the breadwinner. And he would bring home his money to his mom. And it turned out that today there's a couple handfuls of auto manufacturers, not many. Back then, the auto industry, there were auto manufacturers all over the place because you didn't have to have major corporations to do that. And there were a few down there, and he got working for a company that was making the Freyer Miller, I think it was Freyer Miller, and they took a liking to him, and he got to test drive cars, and they were known for testing them for their speed. And so he ended up becoming a race car driver. And he went from his dad being gone, him being the breadwinner for his mom and his family, to would have been 1910, 1912, the guy was making $40-some thousand a year, which was phenomenal amount of money back then. And opportunities came for him, but he's always forever linked with the Red Baron. You know the Red Baron? You know the Red Baron, for as great as he was, dies in 1918. 1918. Stop and think of what the world was in 1918. Eddie Rickenbacker, his counterpart, didn't have as many kills, but the Red Baron was in the war from the beginning. Rickenbacker comes into the war late, and then he has to talk his way because he's considered old. He's considered old. What would he have been? Born in 1890, so 26, 27. He was considered old.
27?
And he got into the war as a staff car driver. And then got over there, convinced somebody, and they let him become pilot. And he was really good at flying. They were open cockpit. And some of them would have a double barrel shotgun. And then some of them, he had a gun on the end of his plane. But his racing skills as a race car driver set him up for his reactions. He was a natural. And he was, by that time, 27, wasn't a kid.
Wow.
And so he ended up shooting down, I think, 26. 2 of them were balloons he shot down. But he had said that he had escaped death many dozens of times. But anyhow, he lived to 1973. What he saw by 1973 that the Red Baron never saw past 1918. It's night and day. Night and day between what those 2 guys lived to see and what one didn't. And of course, Rickenbacker becomes the CEO of Eastern Airlines. And he took Eastern to the top. That was when flying was flying. You had China, you had crystal, you had silver. The guys wore coats and ties, women wore dresses and hats, and the whole shebang. It was an experience. But he was also, he took Cadillac, what we know Cadillac to be today. Cadillac back in the day was going under. And Eddie, early on, Eddie pulled him out. He went and visited every dealer in the United States, retrained them, encouraged them, and Cadillac is still around today. He became an executive with American Airlines, fixed their problems, started his own car company called the Rickenbacker, which was a luxury car. And he had the hat and the ring on the hubcap. I mean, it's beautiful vehicles. He originated four-wheel brakes mass production. We have out here today, we have brakes in the front and the back because of Eddie Rickenbacker. Ford and Studebaker, they weren't buying into it. They had rear wheel brakes. And Ford and Studebaker had massive inventories of cars. So they conspired to put Eddie out of business, and they did. But Eddie didn't walk away from his debt. He paid his entire debt back. And he talks about that in his autobiography. That he was probably, I consider him to be the greatest American that ever lived. You can't read his biography and not come away with Congressional Medal of Honor. You start with that. And then he owned the Indianapolis 500.
Oh, my.
He made it, he brought it into the big time. He put it on radio. Of course, now it's TV, but he put it on radio. He put a golf course in the center of the track. He had the city of Indianapolis build highway systems out to it so that thousands of people had decent roads to get to. And he raced in it. He owned it. He promoted it. Eastern Airlines, American Airlines, Cadillac, the Rickenbacker Car Company, Congressional Medal of Honor. President Roosevelt used him as a war liaison back before we had Zoom. He would go in his wool suit and his fedora, and he'd carry messages to the South Pacific, to the generals, to the admirals. And he was flying one day, he was flying on a B-17 in the South Pacific with a bunch of young 20-something crew members. And they ran out of fuel, they lost radio contact, they crashed. And these guys were in 3 different rafts, it's in the book, 3 different rafts at sea. And they got out of there with like an orange and a string and a hook. And that was it. And one guy panicked and he starts drinking seawater.
Oh, no.
And it's over for him. It's over for him when you do that. And so they waited until it rained, and they lasted 3 weeks. They wrung their clothes out and drank the rainwater. And I think they may have caught a fish, one fish with a hook. But Eddie was a man of prayer, and he began to pray, and a seagull came and landed on his fedora hat. He grabbed the seagull, killed it, and they ate it raw.
Oh, yeah. Well,
And
They lived.
if it hadn't have been for Eddie, those 4 crew members, one did die, would have all perished. And so, I mean, it's just, I think the greatest, and then they wanted him to run for president against Roosevelt in 44 for the Republican nomination. And he would have won. He was more popular than Roosevelt was, and Roosevelt was popular. You know what Eddie says? He's magnanimous. He says, I don't think in the middle of a war, this country should change. I think it would send the wrong signal. But I found out, I took my grandmother back in the 80s, who's no longer living, over to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at the museum, and they had an Eddie Rickenbacker stuff. And she lit up, Eddie Rickenbacker, Eddie Rickenbacker. Everybody in this country that came out of the 20s and 30s knew who Eddie Rickenbacker was. He walked on water. Eddie Rickenbacker would have been president of the United States in 1944. I'm certain of it. Because he was 54 years of age, right at the right age. He was sharp, virile. Roosevelt, had health issues, as we know. And so he's just a phenomenal figure in American history. And most people don't even know any of that. And here he is, he's in our backyard. In fact, he's buried down at Green Lawn. You know where Green Lawn is?
Yes, I've seen this before.
Yeah, down there, he's buried down there. And,
How old was he when he passed? 83?
73 plus 10, 83, yeah. But, you know, he received over 10 or 12 honorary doctorates.
Oh, my.
And I haven't told you this yet. He had this incredible sense of being able to see the future. In the 1930s, he was telling people that we're going to have these boxes in our home, and we'll be able, it was television. He was telling us television was coming. He said the United States would be reduced to the size of Texas by commercial air travel. He's credited with being the guy that drove the market with Eastern for flying from the Northeast to Florida for vacation. Eastern Airlines. He was out in front of that, promoting that. Leave New York, leave Michigan, leave Ohio, come to Florida in January. And so he's the guy that moved that market.
Do you know what age that would have been?
Would have been in the late 50s, late 1950s. And then he was out front with, he said, the only way to combat communism is with a strong Air Force, which is what we did. We won that Cold War with our Air Force power, in large part. I mean, it's just phenomenal man, and is worthy of having his name out there. And I mean, you won't find many that really know very few of those things.
Wow. I have to thank you, but I think we need to move on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.